Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about memorization, which is an extremely important topic for the bar exam. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are talking about memorization, everybody's favorite topic.
Yeah, because I'll be honest, I'm a pretty bad memorizer. And this was really it was a struggle for me on the bar exam.
I mean, the bar is hard. It's a lot of material.
Well, it would be hard even if it were open book, and it's not open book.
Yeah,
exactly. I'm sure most of our listeners know this, but just in case, the bar exam is indeed a closed book exam. So that means you've got to keep all of the information you need in your head, and it is a lot of information. I mean, you have 7 MBE topics, and you have a lot of other...
Yeah, I mean, in California, 13 to 15, depending on how you count them.
I was like, I don't even know how we count, really. I mean,
because some people count wills and trusts as separate topics. Some people put them together. It's kind of complicated.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking 10 plus additional topics. So almost 20 legal areas that you have to be at least conversant in.
Right. And I think a lot of people, when we talk to people who failed the bar exam, not being able to memorize the material is definitely one of the things that we hear over and over again.
Yeah, and a lot of that, I think, frankly, is people start too late. So when do you think people should start memorizing for the bar exam?
When they start studying for the bar exam.
I mean, how do I do that? I don't even know anything at that point.
Well, I'm glad you have tuned in to the podcast. So I think that people think that learning the law and memorizing and applying it are really separate things.
That's true.
And I think that a lot of the commercial bar companies kind of present them as two different things, because it's like you go to these lectures and then you do maybe a couple of their assignments and then maybe you do some essays, but there's not as much focus on how you're supposed to put this information into your brain and hold it there. Whereas I think where we land on this idea, and let me know if I'm right, is this idea that every step that you interact with this law, you should be putting it in your brain.
Right. Well, I mean, that's kind of the basics of spaced repetition, which is kind of how people learn things. You've got to get this stuff from your short-term memory into your long-term memory. So, I mean, it's just like learning a language. I mean, this basically is learning a language.
Right.
You've got to see this material over and over again in different ways before it's going to actually stick in your long-term memory. And there are techniques you can use to expedite that process, but it's not just like, oh, I watch a lecture on community property, and I kind of, do some stuff with it for a few days, and then 2 months later, I sit down and I try to memorize all of that for the exam. It's probably not going to be very effective. Whereas if you're constantly working with that, once a week or once every other week, that kind of thing, it's going to be a lot easier to memorize because you've basically been putting it into your head all along.
Yeah, so you can sit down at the beginning of your commercial bar course, if that's what you're doing, and look at their schedule. And I will tell you what most of them are going to look like. Is you're going to do 3 days of evidence, and then you might not see evidence again for a
you get your half
really
week
long
basically.
Time. And so a lot of people just say, great, now I must know evidence, and they lay it to the side.
Yeah, done with that one.
Done with that one, check. And then they don't come back to it until maybe they do a practice MBE set, of a 3-hour set, or towards the end when they're supposed to, quote unquote, memorize everything in the last 2 weeks.
Do the practice that most people are not doing because they're too busy watching videos.
Right. And so that's a problem because that's not how our brains learn. We need to constantly be kind of building on this material. So when we develop our study schedules in-house, one of the things we focus on is, making sure that you see these subjects more than once, multiple times, and then give you opportunities to go back and review stuff from the last few weeks. We want you to build on this material. And I think the beauty of the MBE is you can have these 7 subjects, and then once those are done, it's very easy to continue reviewing them because you should be continuing to do MBE practice throughout the rest of your substantive review. But I think it can just be very easy to leave so much of this law to the side and say, well, I'll come back to it when it's time to memorize. But memorizing all the bar materials in 2 weeks is practically impossible.
Yeah, it's just not going to happen. And I think, too, as you're thinking about memorizing law, you have to think about how you're learning the law. And this means thinking about what you're actually trying to learn, so that you want to probably focus on elements, for example, because that's ultimately going to be easier to recall than some long drawn out outline that you're never going to be able to get into your head. I mean, you cannot memorize a telephone book size information, nor do you need to for the bar exam.
Right. And I think that, how this differs from a lot of your law school classes is we're not doing a deep dive.
No, this is not like you need to know every detail of community property. You don't need to know every possible thing about corporations or agency, partnership. I mean, you may have spent a whole semester on corporations. You basically need to be able to say the business judgment rule, and like to know something about like how you transfer shares, what happens if a minority partner is getting screwed over by the majority partner.
Right.
But these are, you don't need that much information.
Right. How you set up a partnership.
Right. Like what are I mean, it's like a 1 to 2 page outline basically of major topics you need to know to write, particularly an MEE essay, because they're only 30 minutes.
Right. And I think one of the things that shocks people often when they, let's say get the results because they weren't successful, and they will find that the essays they did the best on were in the classes they may not have even taken.
Oh, yeah. That happens all the time.
Yeah. And people are just flummoxed. They're like, I can't believe that. How's that possible?
Like, I thought I knew nothing about this.
Right.
It's like you didn't. That's why you did okay.
That's why you did okay, because you had just memorized the big sweeping rules, and you'd memorized the terms of art, and you hadn't gotten fancy with anything, and you took everything at face value. And that's really what you're looking for on the bar, is to not do these deep dives. Because if you took an advanced federal courts class and you wrote a treatise on a question that had, a federal courts issue.
Maybe tangentially touch something like jurisdiction.
Right. They're not going to pass you for that question.
Because they want you to be brilliant. Like, personal jurisdiction requires X, Y, and Z. Subject matter jurisdiction requires X, Y, and Z. Let me now apply these to the facts that you have given me and tell you if there is personal jurisdiction in this case or subject matter jurisdiction in this case. Okay, next essay.
Yeah, basically that's all they're looking for. So when you memorize this law, you have to remember that that's the end game. And I think that it can be a shift to come from those law school exams to the bar exam, because it is going to feel more cursory.
And you're probably going to feel uncomfortable because you're used to trying to know everything.
Yeah.
And that's literally impossible.
And that's one of the reasons really smart high achievers fail the bar.
Right.
They overstudy.
I think oftentimes people get really bogged down in certain areas trying to learn everything, and then they don't really even touch areas that are likely to show up. My classic example, didn't know professional responsibility was on the exam, kind of a major oversight.
Right.
Kind of shocking I passed. Thank you for the MBE and the performance test in 3 days. But, I think you do have to be a lot more strategic about the bar in terms of what you're trying to learn, what you're trying to study. I think your point earlier about terms of art being key is so important, because, people are not spending much time grading.
Right. Minutes grading. So they are skimming, and you need to show them those terms of art. That's why elements are so powerful. If you have a 4-element test, number them, make them very easy to see, use the terms of art, and then you get a nice check mark next to it. You get those points and you get to move on. Yeah.
And this is also why it's so important to really memorize these things. If you have a 4-element test, you need a way to remember all those 4 elements. And sometimes it may be that you need to remember them in a certain order, that type of thing. So you're going to get even extra credit, basically, probably even above and beyond what you got in a law school exam where you had more time and your professor might be able to figure out what you were talking about. That is not the case on the bar.
Right.
It needs to be very like, these are the 4 elements that I'm going to be discussing. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Right. Now I'm going to discuss these 4 elements.
Right. In an IRAC form.
Like, here's my analysis. Here's my conclusion. This is the outcome. Now I'm moving on to the next essay. It's really almost like a slot machine.
Yep.
So you've got to memorize this stuff.
You've got to. And you may or may not find that your commercial bar review providers' materials resonate with you and help you memorize this stuff. They might be too dense.
Also, like, are they even talking about, like, how do you memorize these things? I don't know. Maybe some mnemonics.
Maybe. So if you don't have those materials in your commercial bar prep books or outlines or whatever, then you either need to make your own, which we're a fan of, or you need to go find some other commercial ones. Things like SmartBarPrep, things like lean sheets, things that can help you kind of pare down this information and put it into a more digestible form. But if you've got the time, it's always better if you do it yourself.
Right. And it's something you have to start from scratch. You can start from a SmartBarPrep outline or lean sheets outline and then kind of make it your own. And then your own version is what you memorize.
Right. These are more like attack plans, not like treatises.
No, it's literally the elements of the black letter law that you need to apply on the bar exam. That is your goal.
Right. I mean, in just an example, let's talk about torts. So, I may not have all my torts law memorized right now, but I could basically tell you what you have to have memorized for torts. I mean, you've got to know, the elements of negligence. And then for each of those, you've got to say, you've got to know the commonly tested duties, right? Reasonably prudent person, you see,
children, people with disabilities,
right? Landowner, occupier, these are the very, the commonly tested
ones, there are 3 of those. I don't remember what they are, but, there are 3 of them.
Right. And so you kind of have these big things, and then you just need to know, what is the rule for children? What's the rule for landowner, occupier? What's the rule for landlord, tenant? And just spit them out.
And there are rules for all of these. You don't need to think about it.
Right. And
it's what is the duty of a bystander? Okay. What if that bystander is a doctor?
Right. Exactly. And then it's now I get to causation. What's my rule for approximate cause? What's my rule for actual cause? It's what's my rule for intervening causes? All of this stuff is not complicated, but that's the way you need to do it. So
if you're last clear chance, I'm remembering from 1L year,
Right. So if you're memorizing this, that's the level at which you need to be able to discuss it. So
we're not going into the theory behind Paul's graph at this point. We're just proximate cause requires X.
Right. And you want the word foreseeable in there.
Yeah.
Because that's that's the word that the graders are looking for. If you're, here's a quick tip. If your proximate cause rule doesn't include the word foreseeable, it's a pretty bad proximate cause rule.
Right, because that's pretty much the nature of it. And we could talk for endless hours, and probably endless law review articles have been written about what this really means. This is not the point of the bar exam.
Right.
Bar exam wants you to write down, is it foreseeable? And then do a couple of sentence analysis of yes, it was foreseeable because X.
Right.
Moving on.
Right.
Or it was not foreseeable. Or this point is debatable, but I think a court would probably decide why.
Yeah. And then you move on. So this is a different level of material than you've probably been studying in law school. And that's okay. But you have to, again, study for the end game, which is why the application of the law and the practice is so important, because you need to clearly understand the level of detail that you need to know for the essays. Now, just before we dive into different memorization techniques, one note about the kind of 2 different major markets. You've got kind of the California market, you've got the UBE market. So in California, it's a bit more everything in the kitchen sink. So if you're studying for the California bar,
essays, for those of you who are not aware, are twice as long.
Right. So there are 60-minute essays. And so you really need to have a more thoughtful attack plan. If you're doing a negligence question, you're going to go duty, breach, causation, damages. You're going to go through each step. You have time to go methodically through each step, and they want you to do that. They're going to give you points for all of that. The MEE, the essay portion of the UBE, is a little thinner. It's only 30 minutes. And I like to say that test is a bit more about precision. So if it's a negligence issue, typically you might need to raise, the general theory of negligence and present it, but you really need to get to where the pain point is. So if it's a question about causation, make sure that you get to causation, and that's where you spend your time, because that's where your points are going to come from. They don't really care about a laborious discussion about duty, because that's not what they were looking for, and you don't have time.
Yeah, you basically just need to write down, the duty here is the duty of a reasonably prudent person.
Right.
And that got satisfied because this person was reasonably prudent, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
A few more facts, but basically.
So with that, you have to know all of this law, but you're really looking for, what is being triggered by this question, and then present the law and go and do a deep dive with what is really the issue of that question. So when you're memorizing the law, you want to keep your end game in mind and make sure that you're learning law to spit back out on the page that makes sense. Now, for both of these essays, one of the things that's very important for you to keep in mind when we go through all these different memorization techniques is short and concise rule statements. Don't memorize extra words. No. It is not worth it. Nobody wants to read them.
You don't have time to write them.
You don't have time to write them. They don't want to read a long paragraph about personal jurisdiction. Right. They just want short and concise sentences.
I love when I see that on the MEE. People, our students would send us essays, for example. If they failed, you get your essays back typically. And so we would see them and they're like, I just don't understand. I studied everything. I knew everything. And then you look at them and you're like, you realize 80% of what you wrote on this page was an unrelated rule dump of everything you had studied about personal jurisdiction. That wasn't really what they were even asking about. Of course you failed this essay.
You did not get points for that. They don't give you just smart person points.
No, it's not oh, congratulations, you know a lot of things about this topic. It's the question was actually about, venue or whatever.
Right. Yeah, so you really got to make sure that you're playing the game as presented to you. And when you're memorizing, you want to keep that game in mind. So let's quickly run through maybe some memorization techniques, some of which maybe folks haven't thought about.
Yeah, and one thing too, I think keep in mind, do what works for you and don't forget what's worked for you in the past. So, Lee, for example, does not like flashcards.
I hate flashcards.
Yeah, she studied for the bar, tried to study for the bar using flashcards.
I did. Luckily, it was just a few days.
Probably, not the best use of her time.
Terrible use of time.
If you think, okay, there are things I know how to memorize, I've done this before, particularly if you had a lot of closed book law school exams, do not throw that out the window just because you're like, oh, this technique they talked about sounds kind of cool.
Yeah.
Do what works.
But if you had a cushy law school situation like Allison did, where all your exams were open book, then you definitely want to test some different techniques out and make sure that you know how you memorize this stuff.
Oh, I had no idea. I mean, that's the thing. I had one partly closed book exam my entire law school career, I think, which was evidence. My final semester, which was, I think we had some multiple choice questions. And that was my only experience with having to actually memorize the law and not just have it in front of me.
Those Ivy Leaguers, I tell you.
Well, this is really why people fail the bar from the Ivy League, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's true. All right, so let's talk about a couple of memorization techniques that people should consider. So the first one we wanted to talk about was this idea of immersion. I think most people hear about this as far as it's related to learning a foreign language, but, learning a lot of laws are kind of like learning a foreign language.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is definitely a foreign language. I mean, I just learned Spanish, from living in a Spanish-speaking country. And the reality is you just absorb a lot by osmosis. One of the things that actually improved my Spanish comprehension the most was when I decided to only listen to Spanish songs in the background all day long. So for 6 months, I recall I decided I was only listening. And it doesn't have to be, I think I was listening to the Apple Music Latin pop station or something. And at the time, I didn't even understand them. I had no idea what they were saying. Another one I liked in the beginning when I got there, because the songs are really slow, was it was like the Radio de Amor or something. It was like the love stations.
We listened to Love Easy Listening in Spanish.
Basically, literally that's what it was. Because they use a lot of the same words.
That's true. A lot of besos.
Yeah, a lot of besos, abrazo, mi amor. And they were slow, so I could kind of pick up on them. And then later I moved into the Latin pop when I was better at it. But, the idea here being getting back to the bar exam.
I see a great, discussion here about, learning a language through popular music.
Well, you can. I mean, people do.
People do it with TV, too.
Oh, lots of people learn languages from TV.
Yeah.
And I do think we actually may even have on the site someone who did some music for the bar exam.
I actually just had them write to me recently.
Yeah, some jingles to help you remember this, because we do remember stuff better. So, imagine that you're really struggling here with memorizing stuff. You could be listening to jingles in the background when you're cooking. True. You might want to get a giant poster board and you could put up all of the concepts that you're currently trying to learn, write them down, just seeing them, sort of like how people put notes on the bathroom to themselves, you're amazing. You could apply that same concept to the bar exam.
My notes are more don't forget to do it.
Yeah, well, if you're a self-help guru, I think they tell you to put you're amazing, you're great. But you could also put up the elements of negligence.
That's true.
If you want to remember those, maybe not the first thing you want to see first thing in the morning, but it probably would actually stick in your brain.
Probably. Have I ever told you the story about how my mom taught me the multiplication tables?
No.
Yeah, this is kind of...
That's something you have to memorize.
Yeah, it is something you have to memorize. So we had old school tile walls around a bathtub. It was pretty little. And so she would take a pencil and she wrote the multiplication tables on the different pieces of tile.
Wow.
So I would practice them when I was in the bathtub.
Well, there you go. That is an immersion memorization concept.
It is. Kind of sounds a little intense, but, it got the job done, I guess.
No, I was hanging out with my friend and their kid was in the bath and they were learning the letters because I had some floating letters and it was fun. It was a game.
Yeah, I have some floating letters at my house too.
Yeah, so, you can make it kind of a game that you are going to memorize your exceptions to the hearsay rule while you're cooking. Put them on the wall. You can make them different colors. Color also can be a very effective way to memorize things, and you can kind of switch them out. But you want to be more immersed in this. So maybe you record yourself reading these, and you listen to that while you're cooking. I mean, a lot of this is happening in the kitchen. I've been spending a lot of time cooking lately. But the reality is, you need to eat.
It's true,
and you are spending a lot of time there. So it might seem very boring to hear yourself reading your negligent outline or something, but it's probably going to be pretty effective.
Yeah. You can get creative. I mean, it might feel goofy, but, goofy doesn't matter if you pass the bar.
No, and we sometimes, people will even like try to teach things to their inanimate objects in their house or to their pets or sometimes their small children.
Yeah.
So you can lecture to other people. That can be a great way of memorizing things because you're basically learning it through teaching it. So if you've ever been a TA for a class or something, you know that the second time you do it, when you're the TA, you end up learning a lot more than you did the first time around.
That is for sure.
So think of ways you can kind of immerse yourself in these concepts, whether it's visually or, verbally, whatever it is.
I mean, I could see it being really interesting to take like, a MBE subject a day and do stuff like this, and just be like, today is the day that I'm just going to absorb everything I can about evidence.
Right, exactly. And, the next week you cycle back to it and you do it all again.
Right, spaced repetition.
And then basically you're going to have 8 to 10 weeks of having done that. And by the time you get to the very end where you're trying to memorize it, it's probably going to seem pretty familiar to you.
Yep. Yeah, then you're just memorizing the sticky places that are...
Yeah, I mean, I feel like any of us, if we had 10 weeks of spaced repetition, could probably memorize all the hearsay exceptions fairly easily.
Yeah, but I could never memorize all the insanity defenses. That one was really I always had to review that. I reviewed it walking into the bar exam because for some reason I couldn't...
There's the monotone, and that's about all I remember.
Yeah, but they're like 4, and they're slightly different, so they're not different enough that, I don't know.
Yeah.
Everybody's got something.
Yeah, everybody's going to have the ones that you struggle with. And I think actually identifying those early on and knowing that you need to spend more time on them is beneficial, which if you wait until the end to try to memorize, you are not going to know that information.
Yeah, so having a list of those sticky places is a good idea because then when you go back to do that spaced repetition, maybe you start with the 4 insanity defenses.
Yeah, exactly. And, I'm sure after you've done them enough times, you're going to be able to, just do them.
One would think. I swear, I just could not, I don't know. Anyway, all right, let's move on. The next technique we wanted to talk about is a word that we almost always mispronounce.
Acrostics? We're not really sure. Look it up. Acrostics.
Yeah, so this is kind of like mnemonics, which I think most people think about.
Yeah, similar to a mnemonic. The difference being with a mnemonic, you're taking the first letter of each word and kind of making a new word out of it. And it can be like a nonsense. My legs, Roy G. Biv, these kind of things. The difference here is that you're going to make a sentence out of it. Yeah. And so for some people, I think this can be easier because for me, I could just never memorize the mnemonics. Like the actual mnemonic words or phrases. I was always really bad at memorizing those, so it made it kind of pointless.
It wasn't a great memorization technique for you.
Wait, I remember there's something about my feet, my legs. What was that about?
And you're like, my feet, wait.
Yeah, wait,
my marriage, year long. What F? What is F?
Yeah, what is F? So that didn't really work for me. And this is a concept I think could be useful. So instead, you take it and make an actual sentence about it. So say that you need to remember the defenses to strict liability and tort, which are misuse, alteration, and assumption of risk. Now, a mnemonic on that would be like ma, which I would be like moo, mow. What was that one? Not helpful. However, I could make a sentence using MAA, which is, for example, and these can be totally nonsensical. Like, my alien arrives. And I'm like, oh, okay, there's an alien that's sticking in my brain. Maybe he's arriving in a rocket ship. I can remember that.
Right.
So for me, I don't know, something about this seems like it might work better than a mnemonic would work for me personally.
Yeah. You can also, if you need it to memorize, make these phrases linked to the subject. So if this is about strict liability in tort actions, maybe
maybe that rocket ship.
Maybe it's a rocket. Yeah,
that rocket ship is not properly produced.
A type of dog or a wild animal. I was trying to come up with a wild animal while we're sitting here. That starts with an A.
Yeah,
I don't know the snake. What kind of snake? Isn't there a big snake?
Anaconda.
Anaconda. That's right. So you could have my anaconda arrives.
Right.
And then maybe you can remember that is linked to strict liability because strict liability is often around wild animals.
Yeah. So, these can be like a nerdy way to make studying a little less annoying because it's going to be lighter, funnier. So it's up to you if you feel like you want to link them or not link them. I mean, sometimes they can just be totally ridiculous. And the more ridiculous, maybe the easier they are. Yeah. So, for example, if you need to remember the excuse of performance and contract law. So these are the reasons you might get out of not performing your contract. Mistake, impossibility, impracticability. I always confuse those two.
Yes.
Frustration of purpose, rescission, and accord or satisfaction. So you have MIIFRA. MIFRA. Probably not going to work as a mnemonic, But maybe you can make it a sentence. So, for example, most icy igloos feel really awful. Like, that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
You might remember that.
Yeah.
Like, why did that Eskimo not go out and, kill the seal and do his, complete his contract? Because he was stuck in that igloo.
Right.
And it felt really awful. Okay, that's actually, that could work.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that, your bar review company might give you some mnemonics to learn or some of these sentences. They may or may not work for you. I think if you make them up yourself, they're always going to have a bit more meaning. But whatever it is, just play with them to make them, speak to you. Because if you can't retain the sentence, then that's a problem.
Yeah,
that's not really working.
Yeah, I had to switch away from it. I think actually when I made my own mnemonics, they worked okay, but the standard ones, like the my legs, I have literally no idea what that's even about because it just never stuck in my head.
The statute of frauds.
Okay. I'm like, I know I've seen that one, but like, what is? I have no idea.
5 kind of contracts or 6. Yeah. But anyway,
because when I hear my legs, I immediately start visualizing like someone dancing on a stage and like high kicking. Which leads us into our next technique.
I was going to be like, yeah, that's totally nothing to do with contracts.
Yes. So for me, I am a visual learner. So you can also start to think of ways to memorize through visualization, which is a process of creating an image in your mind. And like, I immediately go there. You can see from these sentences, I immediately dropped the sentence and went to a rocket ship or went to the Eskimo out hunting. That's actually a pretty good way to remember stuff. So depending on how your brain works, that might really work for you.
Right.
And this is a concept behind Sketchy Law, which we've talked about before, which is some 3D videos where they do little scenarios to help you understand and memorize the law. So if this is something you're interested in, you can check that out or you can make them yourself.
Yeah. So if you had a rocket ship, let's go back to your rocket ship because we're reading a lot about rocket ships in my house right now. So if you had a rocket ship, what do you typically do, Allison? Do you assign concepts to like the outside of the rocket ship or the different parts of the rocket ship?
Well, for me, like if we were talking about the rocket ship with defenses of strict liability and tort, I might like literally have the rocket ship arriving and then maybe the alien gets out and does something, and that's kind of the next part of the test. I don't really know exactly where this would go, but something along those lines. And then maybe he encounters someone else and like they interact in some way.
Is that more like the storylining, which is the next technique that we're talking about, or is it these two kind of link sometimes?
Well, I think the storylining, as we'll talk, is really more about words, and this is more about concepts.
Got it.
So if you're visualizing, because for me, like I'm not telling the story, I'm literally seeing it.
Oh, I see. You're different. Yeah, that's a good difference.
So, and that's what Sketchy Law is doing. You're watching it. It's like watching a movie. So if your brain works like that, then you can use this to create associations between words. Maybe there are arrangements in the shape of or a drawing, 2-dimensional, that kind of thing. And this is kind of the chambers for a memory palace, or sometimes it's called like the loci concept of memorization, which is how people memorize these epic stories like the Odyssey and the Iliad. So it's something that we've used for a long time, but it can be an interesting and kind of more fun way just to break up like constantly reading, watching lectures, that kind of thing. So if you do think you're a visual learner, this is worth exploring.
So do you think that, when we talked earlier about the importance of spaced repetition and coming back to things, can students count working on these memorization techniques as study time? Because are they
sure.
Yeah, because this is like the learning. This is the heavy lifting,
yeah,
right?
This is like the hard stuff.
Right. This is the hard stuff. And so it might be frustrating or a little more challenging to your brain or make you more tired, but that's because you're actually working your brain.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like you mentioned flashcards earlier, and I did flashcards, I think, once in law school, trying to memorize some cases. But what I did on the front of the flashcards was I actually did a drawing that told me what the case was about. So I probably couldn't tell you what was on the back of those back of those flashcards. Yeah. But if I looked at the front, I could probably be like, oh yeah, that was that case about whatever.
Right.
Because this guy's going into the emergency room because here's a drawing. So depending on how your brain works, drawing and things like that can be super effective. But let's talk about storylining since you brought that up.
All right. So storylining is a memorization technique where you take words to trigger your memory for a particular topic, and then you string them together in a story with a predictable progression. So some people call this narrative memorization. It's an easy concept to understand, but it can take more time to execute than some of the other techniques. So this is one like maybe you try, see if it really resonates with you. If not,
yeah,
be the best use of your time.
Maybe you do it for, your most difficult areas that you really are struggling with, but not for things that you remember pretty quickly.
Right. If you have a really active imagination, you get bored easily. This could be a different way to memorize to kind of spice it up.
Yeah, exactly.
Make it more exciting.
Give us an example.
All right. So let's say that you are trying to memorize the pre-Miranda, something about Miranda. So you're trying to remember the test for whether a person's pre-Miranda statement should be excluded. You can do a simple storyline, like the custodial staff at my school interrogated the students who started the food fight. So custodial and interrogated, a custodial interrogation is what you're looking for with Miranda. It could be easier to memorize than those terms. Or let's say you're trying to remember the 4 requirements for class certification and federal class action. Here's another storyline. I mean, really, this stuff is so exciting. I don't know why people just can't remember it.
Well, class actions are fun.
I mean, class actions are pretty fun compared to some other stuff. So Harry Potter did a number of stupid things. Typically, Hermione would be the one to save the day. Ron's common contribution was just to eat a lot, but they were still the representatives sent to save the world. So here are words that we want to remember are the number and typically common representatives. So again, I don't know that this stuff really works for me, but I could see it working for other people.
Yeah, and again, like, these don't have anything to do with the actual concept, which is totally fine. You know?
Right.
We're looking at like numerosity. Are they typical? Like, you know, are the claims common? Are these people representative?
Right.
You just need to remember those 4 words, and if you're struggling to remember them, then this might be a way to help you do that.
Yeah. All right. Before we run out of time, I want to touch on one more technique for memorization that we really push our students to do, which is handwriting.
Right, which everyone resists, but it is extremely effective. If you just write something over and over, you will probably start to remember it. And that is not to say you can do the same thing with typing. Don't type it, not going to work.
Right. Doesn't reach the same parts of your brain.
No, it definitely doesn't. So if you handwrite, you know, your elements over and over for rules that you're struggling with, your brain will start to remember those.
Yeah. Maybe if you handwrite your outlines, your attack plans, that is a way to memorize and learn. Drilling through handwritten memorization, drawing things, sketching things. I mean, more and more research is coming out now about how using our hands is a way to commit things to memory. That's why they're pushing students to take notes in class on the paper and not on their laptops. I mean, they're all of a sudden finding that nobody's retaining information on their computers.
Oh, yeah. When I did my Reiki workshop, they give you a symbol.
Oh.
And literally she made us write an entire page of them. Over and over, and came and critiqued, like, is your symbol correct? Because she like, I want this to be in your brain, like whether you make it with your hand or draw it on a piece of paper or just envision it, it is a physical thing that you're envisioning.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it had words associated with it and everything, but it was pretty interesting.
That is pretty interesting.
I was like, wow, nobody's really made me like handwrite a whole page of stuff anytime recently.
I know.
But it is effective. So, I mean, that was how I would try to, usually not particularly effectively, but how I would try to memorize the mnemonic devices was by writing them over and over.
Yeah. The other thing I've noticed, I don't remember what I was handwriting recently. I think it was like a card or a note or something like that because we're so used to typing, my brain now thinks words very quickly because I type so much faster than I handwrite that I was skipping words.
Oh, interesting.
And so I think another interesting thing about handwriting is it forces you to slow down a little bit, which also will help with retention.
Right, because again, like what we're trying to do is retain the correct information,
right,
which is much less than the overall information.
Yep.
All right, well, with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. We'd like to take a second to remind you that you can check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of other helpful tips to help you prepare and hopefully stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or the California bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you're still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at, you guessed it, barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.